The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. Always happy to have you here. And this week we are going to take the beginning of a dive into a series, what I anticipate to be a series of videos with these guests, where we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in a bit more detail than we have in the past. I've done episodes where I have done some compare and contrast between Scientology, Mormonism, and Jehovah's Witnesses through the Three Apostates episodes that we did. I think we did about 10 of those a few years ago, and those were a lot of fun. But that's about as deep into Mormonism as I've gone on this channel. So time to go deeper. So to help me with this, and very much welcoming them to my show, is Shannon Grover and Bryce Blankenagel. And I will let them explain their backgrounds connected with this. Welcome to my show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Yes. Shannon, do you want to start with your background or experience with the Mormon Church?
A really, really brief background. Mine could take me 3 hours to give you an overview. But anyway, I was born and raised in the church. I was fourth of 9 children. And I actually spent about 45 years in it before I finally left. And it was just because there was a series of issues that had started really when I was 10 and moved on from there. However, I still did everything I was required to do in the church, because the brainwashing where you're made to believe that you must do all of this to gain the best life in the next life kind of thing. So I did seminary in high school, which just as background on Mormonism, by the way, Mormons see themselves as a peculiar people. And one of the ways they do that is by redefining words. So instead of calling a congregation, their congregation, it's a ward, that kind of thing. So when it comes to seminary, that is not training to become a priesthood leader. They actually don't do extensive training to become priesthood leaders in this church. What it is actually is for kids from 9th grade through 12th grade every year, and they meet every day of the week or every other day of the week on a school day for basically what becomes a Sunday school lesson. They have one book of scripture each year. And so it's the Book of Mormon one year, the next year is the Old Testament, the next is New Testament, the next is Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, the recognized scriptures of the Mormon Church. And it's just a way to really get all of that into them. So I did seminary. I went to BYU Provo. It was just BYU then, because this was the 80s. But I went on a mission. I got married in the temple. I've been to the temple thousands of times. I went through the temple, and this we will get into at some point, but when it was still had the penalties in it where you had to swear to allow somebody to kill you if you talked about it. All of these things. These were all things that I did growing up, and I just threw myself into it all. And so in the church, in the Mormon Church, it is the lay members who do most of the work. And so things like speaking on Sunday, the what we call callings in the church, that kind of thing. There are lay members who do it, who don't get paid. And the bishop, who's the head of your congregation, he's the one that calls you to do it and tells you God wants you to do this calling. It doesn't matter how much time you have to spend on it. You are required to do it. It doesn't matter what qualifications you have. You are required to do it. And so I said yes to pretty much everything because that's required. But I did have doubts that what I did was, and this was our thing we learned way back then, one of the prophets of the church was named Spencer W. Kimball, and his wife wrote up an article for one of the church's magazines called The Ensign. And in it, she said that when she has a doubt, she will just put it away on a shelf and close the door. And when she would come back, she would find the doubt had disappeared. So, that's what we were told to do. And what all of us Exmos will admit to, which, the TBMs or true believing members don't, is that these doubts keep multiplying. They don't disappear. So you keep adding more doubts into this closet of doubts as you grow older. And so there were various things that happened throughout with me that were big watershed moments and of doubts, and we can talk about them on a future episode here. But ultimately, what happened is by the time we got to 2015, I was what we call a PMO, physically in, mentally out, and had been since 2011. And in 2015, we had the Bergefell decision with the Supreme Court where gay people were allowed to get married legally and lawfully. And I know I wasn't the only one going, hey, you know what? This means that they can now go to the temple and take the temple endowments, because the law of chastity in the temple was then that you agree to have no sexual relations with anyone other than your husband or wife whom you are legally and lawfully wedded to. It was like, they're legally and lawfully wedded. So perfect. Well, then that fall, November of 2015, the church came out with an incredibly heinous policy, which was aimed at the children of gay parents, but especially ones whose parents were married. And it was saying they could not join the church until they were adults, and then they had to disavow their parents completely to join the church.
I don't know. I'd heard something about that, but I don't know that I'd heard it spelled out that succinctly as the harsh response that it was. That's so
vicious.
Yeah. I mean, it is vicious. It's straight up, basically, just big fuck you, yes. to all of those people. Wow.
And it's become a bit of a meme in the ex-Mormon culture too. It's just called the November policy, and we just refer to it among our circles as the November policy, and everyone knows exactly what you're referring to because it was so heinous, it was so evil, and it caused a mass resignation event. It was a very ugly time in church history.
It really was.
And that was within the last 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, that was one. I had a couple nephews actually, who had come out of the closet. And I was like, oh, this is great. With Bergefell, I was like, hey, they can still be a part of something with this. But then it was like, nope.
Right.
Nope.
Right.
Not at all.
Because the basic idea is that at the highest levels of the Mormon Church, they just simply don't recognize the legitimacy of LGBTQ people.
No, they don't.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Especially trans. But the PR backlash was huge, and you had some mass leavings of the church. There was something like 1,000 of them that did just publicly left the church after that because of that. And there was plenty of us like me who just stopped going. And I was like, that's it. I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. This is too much against humanity. And so the church sort of rolled back on it publicly, but then quietly, it's back there. It's back on that. They haven't really. And so, because that's how they feel about it. So then that was me leaving. But it took me a really long time, because at this point, 2011, I went through cancer and I stopped going to church every week because church is a petri dish. And when you have chemo, you have no immune system. So I stayed away from church. And pulling back and not getting that brainwashing, all the repetition, which is what brainwashing, I think, is now. It's not the movies and the stuff, torture techniques and shit, but it's that repetition just hammered into your head from birth on. Not getting that made it easier for me to pull back. And instead of painting my rose-colored glasses even more rose-colored, it made it so there was chips coming off of it. And I was able to look at the church a little more clearly. So for that 4 years, that was coming into play with me. And I found legitimate health reasons not to go to church, because I have health reasons. I had them for 30 years. And even after I was done with the chemo. But then when the 2015 policy happened, then I spent the next 4 or 5 years learning how to break free of all of that conditioning. And it's still a struggle for me,
Of course.
especially because like I've said 100 times everywhere else, pretty much every church there is, men and women are treated differently. And in the Mormon Church, that difference is the size of a canyon. And so for me, being raised in the church as a woman, there is much that was beaten out of me to the point where if priesthood said something, I said yes.
Right. Right.
And that was hard. I mean, for example, we had a moment in, what was it, 2021? And I joined the podcast as a co-host in 2020. Our podcast is the GlassBox podcast, by the way. And I'd come on as a co-host in 2020. And it was like Christmas of 2021. The bishop of the ward we live in showed up at our house to get my spouse to go to a meet and greet, which I was like, those are for single people at the ward and everything. And so, he's there trying to convince him. And the bishop is saying to him, that my spouse going, is it your wife that keeps you from going and all this? And my spouse got really angry. So at any rate, I had come into the room to sort of diffuse things because I could hear my spouse's tone of voice and I knew how angry they were getting. And so the bishop's ready to leave. And the bishop asked my spouse, can I give you a hug? And that my spouse agrees. And then he comes to me and I put my hand out to shake his hand. He ignored that and he hugged me and he rubbed my back from shoulders to ass and back. And I froze. And I'm like, this was 4 years ago. I completely froze. I couldn't say a word because this was a bishop.
Right.
And I was so angry. I was sobbing afterwards. I spent the rest of the day trying to deal with the trauma of that event.
Okay. Wow.
And this was the training I'd had. So this is what I've come from. Yes, I've been involved all of it. I mean, I know a lot of what the conditioning is because not only did I experience it, I actually helped perpetuate it. And everything else. And so I know how it all gets used. And so that's one of my things. And so part of that is why I like being on the GlassBox, because GlassBox, as we say, we take on headlines in and out of Mormonisms to see what slipped through the cracks.
Right.
And
Awesome.
So anyway.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, kind of breakdown. Yeah, no, I get it. And believe me, I get it. I mean, it's hard to summarize,
4 to 5 years, actually. Yes.
Yeah, of experience, right? And especially when there's so much to be said about it. But, I hear you. So let's get it out there. And Bryce, what about you?
Yeah. So I had much less of a time and life invested into the church. But I was born and raised in, Utah, in the county just north of Salt Lake. And, born, raised in the covenant, as it's often called. I come from pioneer heritage. My great grandparents were the ones coming across the plains who joined the church in the 1830s, and they were OGs and bodyguards of just those markers that mark you as a stalwart and faithful true blue Mormon. So I had all those indicators and grew up in a faithful house, believing it and practicing it regularly, doing all the things necessary as you grow up in the church. And I think it's important. Shannon said something that her response to the priesthood was what you just talked about, Shannon. People might think, priesthood, the leadership of the church, sort of, but also when you are someone in the church who was born with the penis, then when you turn 12 years old, you gained the priesthood. So there's more to it than just, the priesthood is who directs the affairs of the church. It's every single biologic man who grows up as a man in the church and continues to present as a man in the church gains access to the magic powers in the church. And therefore, just by virtue of turning 12 years old, you are granted a modicum of authority over everybody who doesn't have the priesthood. So it fuels a lot of, let's just say, dangerous proclivities in young men, and offers them plenty of opportunities to access delusions of grandeur. And I felt those. So I continued going to church. And as I got further into my teenage years, I didn't like going to church very much. I believed in it, but didn't like going to church. And eventually kind of pulled away from the church. I had one older sibling who left before I did and had a lot of, I guess the best way to describe it would be boundary setting fights with my parents. And my parents learned from my older siblings' experience that if we resist Bryce leaving the church, then that's going to cause him to rebel and we'll lose control. So we're just going to kind of let him do what he wants, which is wonderful. It was wonderful for my mental health. I mean, it means that I got out of the church way, way, way less scathed than most people who leave the church. So eventually I stopped going about the age of 16. And after I went to a year of college at Weber State University, I needed to get out of my parents' house for my own safety, for my own survival. I had to get out on my own. I had to enter the workforce and plug myself into the real world. And I eventually left Utah. And that was the absolute best thing for me, because you don't get a real sense of how insular and how cloistered and protected Utah is until you're looking at it from the outside. It's a very, very strange place to view as now an outsider of it. So eventually I left. And after I left, I started listening to atheist activists and podcasts and kind of getting involved into the atheist movement. And I, by virtue of wanting to know more about atheism and in general in philosophy, that caused me to wonder about the history of Mormonism. It's like, all right, so what did I grow up in? I kind of had this few years where I just didn't really care. I didn't believe it anymore. I didn't want to attend. I didn't want to go to any church. And now these atheists are saying things that make a lot of sense to me. And speak to my emotions in very representative ways. So I started wondering, what's the history of the church that I grew up in? What did I just grow up in? Is Mormonism a cult? I wanted to know these hard questions that would have been much harder for me to deal with as a believing member. But now, as an outsider kind of looking in on it, as a former Mormon looking at my past, I wanted to know more about it. So that caused me to start studying church history and then start podcasting on church history.
Awesome.
And that leads us to here.
With a Glassdoor podcast that you guys do.
Yeah, so it started out as Naked Mormonism, and that's a serialized history of Joseph Smith. I mean, episode 1 starts with the birth of Joseph Smith, and then the podcast went on hiatus at the death of Joseph Smith. So it's just a chronology of the most notable events in early church history. And through that, there were all sorts of things going on in the current day church, current events that I wanted to talk about, but the podcast Naked Mormonism was focused on the history of the church and Joseph Smith's timeline. So I couldn't really branch out. I couldn't do anything and talk about modern events or current events or things that were going on or big scandals in the church without it diluting the objective of the show. So that led me to start GlassBox Podcast with my co-host at the time, Braden Ham. And then Shannon was she was our resident general authority because she would comment on every episode, and really good and thought-provoking and fun comments, and we'd read them at the end of every episode. So Braden and I were just like, she's pretty much just a general authority, which is a Mormon term for like the highest ranking leadership body, right? Yep. So eventually we invited her on to the show, episode 52, is it?
52. Yep.
52, where Shannon told her entire story, and then she started co-hosting immediately after that because it was you're just too much fun to hang out with.
It was, we had a good time on that. I think it just clicked personality-wise, but I also think it was really fortuitous that I started then, because Braden's life was super, super, super busy.
Correct.
And I think at that point he was holding on because he felt like if he quit, that would be the end of it but it would, Bryce wouldn't be able to keep doing what he was doing with it the way he wanted to do it. And so having me come on, it was like, okay, good. Because it was just a few months later that Braden let us know he was going to have to quit. And I think it was such a relief for him. He didn't put it that way, but it sounded that way when he talked to us, that is like, okay, I can hand the reins off to Shannon.
Nice. And I'm sorry, I got the name wrong there. So it's GlassBox
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Tell him why you made that name,
Yeah.
why you chose GlassBox.
Yeah, so this goes to a fun story from Joseph Smith. A little bit of background, right? So he, according to the legend of Joseph Smith, an angel descended and told him where these ancient gold plates were buried. This manuscript, this artifact from Native American Christian Hebrews, pre-Columbian. I know, right? It's crazy when you say it that way. But it's religion. So anyway, here we are. Through a couple of fascinating circumstances, he ended up needing to store something. It was to store, in my opinion, a manuscript for the Book of Mormon. And in order to do that, he borrowed a family member's glass box. And what that means is there are wooden boxes that you would transport your glass in, right? Glass, carpet, any wall coverings were extremely valuable. So when you would move houses, you would pull up your carpet, you would pull the windows out of the house, and you would carry it with you. So this was a wooden box that was used to transport window glass. So that whatever was in that GlassBox podcast, that's Joseph Smith's like closest held secrets. And it is the foundation of the Book of Mormon, whatever was in that. So it's kind of like, it's as much historical mystery of what was in that box as much as modern day with how the church operates as a legal black box. We want to know what's hiding in the glass box. We want to see whatever the power that be is trying to hide away from the world. We want to open that box and see what's in.
What's in the box?
That's right.
What's in the box? What a great metaphor, though. I love that. And I just learned something because I did not know that that's what a glass box was called. So that they do that even. So that's really fun to learn. And yeah, oh boy. So okay, let's go big, and then we'll just go where it goes here. I had a vision here, folks listening to this right now, that we would start for our beginning episode here with a sort of overview, a sort of big picture look at the Mormon Church. And so I'm going to start with this stupidly broad question to both of you. Which is, what is the Mormon Church? I mean, from your lived experience, study and research, historical knowledge, you've got to, just like with me with Scientology and with some other cults, you got this big picture kind of concept of it. And at the end of the day, when I talk about Scientology, if somebody really wants the short, clipped version, the one sentence deal, it is that Scientology, the Church of Scientology, is a money-making scam disguising itself as a religion, which actually, and then I can append to that, which actually has occult origins. And that's Scientology. That's it. That's all there is to it, right? When we talk about Mormonism, though, or the Mormon Church, we talk about an organization that has grown to truly millions of members, where Scientology just lies about that. And a worldwide organization that has been around for over 100 years and has things to say about its membership and the way that it gets around and that kind of thing. And also, it's a group that seems to own an entire state of the United States of America. Which is something that not all cults get to say. So I've already decided it's a cult, so that's why I'm going to call it that. But you guys tell me, what's your take on this? What is the Mormon Church?
The Mormon Church is a cult, and we're done here. We're done?
I know.
No.
I mean, it's like George Carlin said, that famous quote of his: religion has actually convinced people, many of them adults, that there's an invisible man who lives in the sky and watches everything you do every minute of every day, and he needs money.
Yes.
That's Mormonism. Yeah. And so you've got this overview of control, but also you got to pay us money if you want to do anything. So, that's really the issue. I mean, when it comes to things like going to the temple, because that's the epitome of things you need to be able to do in the church to be able to attain the highest degree of the celestial kingdom. Okay. back off here, back up a little bit. Mormons have their own idea of heaven. Remember, peculiar people. So they have 3 degrees of glory, as they call it, 3 basic heavens. There's the lowest telestial kingdom, middle terrestrial kingdom, top celestial kingdom. And there's levels in all of these, multiple levels. We don't know really how many in each one. But the celestial kingdom, the very top level, is the one that has a name, and that is called exaltation. That's the most important one because that's the one where people who have been married in the temple and have lived a celestial marriage get to go. So this is where that quote from, I think it's Paul in the New Testament, who says, neither the man without the woman nor the woman without the man in the Lord. This is how it gets interpreted for Mormonism is exaltation. You have to have the man and the woman together. That's the level where you get to become a god. Okay.
Okay.
So,
is that where you get your own planet?
yes, where you get to create your own planet. Men have multiple wives because that's Joseph's thing. And this is, the whole point is more offsprings, your own universe of all the planets and people and all that shit, and just perpetuate this whole idea. And so what gets held over your head as a Mormon is you must do exactly what I tell you to do at all times and to give us money at all times that we asked for, or you can't achieve exaltation. And here's the thing. When you get a recommend that allows you to go through the temple, there's several questions you're asked in it. You can really fail on any one of them, including adultery, including that. You can cheat on your wife all you want and still get into the temple as long as you're paying your tithing.
Oh,
but if you're
okay,
right, if
okay.
you're not paying your tithing, they'll take your temple recommend away until you make it current.
Right. And this,
yes, I've had it taken away from me before because of that.
No, it's good. Thank you for bringing that up. And the tithing thing is something I've had a question about for a long, long, long time because it's 10% of your income is supposed to be automatic off the top, gross, right? Just goes to the church. And that's an obligation or a voluntary expectation?
Voluntary.
Yeah.
It's an obligation if you want all the benefits of the church.
Okay, so membership is basically the tithing system, and membership has its benefits.
Yes.
Correct.
But if you don't tithe, somehow those just aren't available to you.
Exactly.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. And they tell you straight up, that's why?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and you have to, you meet with your bishop at the end of every year for what's known as tithing settlement. I think it has a new name now because tithing settlement sounds like a bishop is just shaking you down because that's what it is, right? That you come in, the bishop shows you your tithing record for the year and he asks you, staring deep into your eyes, is this a faithful and or a full and honest tithe? And when he's saying that, of course, the implication is that if you're lying about this, you're not lying to your bishop. You are lying to God about how much money you gave God. Do you really want to be caught lying to God? And it's important to understand the power that bishops wield. Bishops are, as Shannon said earlier, this is a calling. These are lay clergy, and who are running the vast majority of the church. And they have no training. They have no resources available to them, but they are fulfilling the roles of pastors, of counselors, of crisis support, of social support when people have situations where they need to call on the church for food or for help or for paying the bills or whatever. The church has a very sufficient welfare program, but it only pays out to people who are current on tithing and faithful attending members.
And fast offerings. Don't forget that.
And fast offerings as well, yeah. So it's important to understand the power that bishops wield without any training or qualifications. They are referred to as judges in Israel. And we are taught that bishops have what's called the power of discernment, meaning that they have a priesthood key. It's called, that's the magic powers is all men get the priesthood, but you get certain keys depending on what your calling is. So one of the priesthood keys that every bishop gets is the power of discernment, which allows them to supernaturally detect whether or not you're lying. And so you have that cultural implication as well as the actual covenant aspect of it. When you're making a covenant with the church, you're making a covenant with the Lord. The two things are synonymous. So anything that your bishop says, it is seen as direction from God. Anything that you say to your bishop is your confession to God. The bishop does act as the middleman, only man in between people and their God on every single aspect of all religious worship in the church. So it's just important to understand how much power bishops have. And we also call it the leadership roulette, right? Because you might get a bishop that is awesome. And I had one bishop who was a fantastic bishop, who was also my soccer coach, who was, also, a neighbor, right? Because these are very tight-knit insular communities, especially in Utah. But you can look into any ex-Mormon forum and see just the horror stories of bishops. There are a lot of exceptionally bad bishops out there, and there is no mechanism, there is no checks and balances, there is no way to complain about a bishop's conduct and behavior and have them ousted. There is no system, there is no check, there is no balance. So it just fosters a very dangerous hierarchical structure.
Yeah, I'll save, that's for sure. And of course, this opens about a million questions right now, but I want to try to stay focused on the bigger picture. So I'm not going to dive into too many details right now, but I'm looking at everything right now.
Taking notes on all the questions you're going to ask later.
Because of course, and a system of unaccountability is a recipe for disaster, and in any group. And then when you have a religious group, then a power from God and all that, the potential for abuse becomes huge. We know already, and I've talked at length about the interviews that they do with the kids, or the teens about the sex stuff. And I found that to be pretty objectionable, especially out of unlicensed, untrained people with no oversight or regulation, as you just pointed out. But it's almost unbelievable. Like, wait a minute, there's no one watching these guys? Who's giving them direction or giving them their discernment? There's nothing. There's just no one you can go to.
Correct. And what they operate by is called the Bishop's Handbook. And up until recently, these were tightly held, closed, secret documents that were always leaked on the internet anytime they published a new version of it. But the handbook is basically it's supposed to be the thing of if somebody comes to a bishop and says, I have this problem, I've been doing this sin. Well, so there's something in the handbook for it. There's some sort of rubric that the bishop can use that determines the person's punishment for their sins. Yeah. And a bishop can stick to the letter of the law and run a really tight ship, or a bishop can be very lenient and very kind. Once again, that goes back to the bishop roulette.
Yes. Okay. And the handbook allows for that, for him to decide because of all of it. And here's one thing to take note of with this as well, is 95% of the time, a man and a woman can confess to the same sin, and the woman's punishment will be worse.
Yes.
95% of the time. And the other 5% has to do with her winning at Bishop Roulette.
Okay.
This is consistent across the board.
And what do you think would drive that? Because 95% of men are not monsters. So what
and this would be 95% of all of the ones that come in there. So there's there's hundreds of examples like this where you have this couple who are engaged, and then they were out too late. They were past midnight together. They were kissing while they were laying on the couch, end up committing fornication, and they go in and confess. He gets told, well, okay, you need to not take the sacrament. That's the Eucharist or whatever you want to call it now. That happens every Sunday, is the sacraments in the regular meetings. Not take the sacrament for the next month, but other than that, you're okay. She gets disfellowshipped.
Disfellowshipped, just straight up kicked out.
Not quite. That's the next step before excommunication.
Okay.
So then everyone sees that. Or he is told, I need you to come in each week and talk to me about it. She is told, I need you to come in each week and talk to me about this and show me how you're repenting. She will get asked very specific, invasive questions. He will not.
Okay. Okay. And
The
there's this.
disparity of treatment is
Yes,
it's one of those things that you have to live it to see it,
Yeah.
but it is consistent and ubiquitous.
No, fair enough. You're here to tell me. So
No,
I'm
it's okay. It's all
trying
right.
to clarify the situation because, that's a very, that claim is really like, wow, 95% of the time the women is going
This
to
is
get
this is
like
my estimation. So,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
isn't an actual number. This is the estimation just by everything I see
Fair
and
enough.
everything we
Fair
see.
enough.
So,
Yeah.
and that's not saying that it happens to all women or all men, but it happens consistently enough to be a real problem.
Yeah, there's an imbalance there for
Right.
sure.
Because
And
it's the woman's fault if something happens. Even to the point where one of the apostles, so we have what we call the Q15, which is you've got the first presidency, which is the prophet and his two counselors, and then you have the 12 apostles. And so they're put into being an apostle in a specific order, so they just move up, and that's how it's determined who becomes the prophets. It's just the next one in line of who was ordained to be an apostle. So it's like right now we have Russell M. Nelson in there. The next one will be Dallin H. Oaks. We already know that. So anyway, one of the apostles several years back, it was, I think, like 2014-ish or somewhere under there. His name was Richard G. Scott. And he was speaking in General Conference, which happens twice a year. It's broadcast to the world. So millions and billions of people are watching it. And he actually said up there that if you have been a victim of assault, you need to look into your own life and see what you should repent of.
yeah, that's culty for sure. No
Yeah.
question about that. I mean, that's straight out of Scientology's playbook and straight out of, victim
Yes.
shaming and blaming 101, which has been
It's
pretty,
exactly what our society is.
yeah,
What were you wearing? Girls
that's
get
right.
asked that. What were you wearing? What color underwear? What kind of underwear? What was your underwear wet? Was this all that shit. So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
yes.
it's gross. Okay, so there's a culture of misogyny there kind of baked in, is what you're basically saying.
Yes, basically it is.
Yeah.
That's yeah, like pretty much every church there is except maybe like two.
Yeah, there's there's a few. There might be a couple more, but
Yes.
yes, I get your point. I definitely do.
Well, and Chris, you said something that I want to kind of hone in on too, because there is absolutely no oversight outside in from the church, but the culture itself is built on oversight and tattling. And so that's very, very important to understand that we have, when I was growing up, it was called home teaching and visiting teaching. Now it's called ministering. It's a rebranding of the same thing. But essentially, you are assigned friends in the church, and you go and meet with those friends once a month to check up on them, see how their family is doing, see if their family needs help with anything, and to read them a message out of the Ensign, the church's magazine. The first presidency's message is usually the case. And so what this amounts to, right? It seems very awesome. This community is looking out for each other. It's a cohesive community, and they're just looking to help each other out and support each other when somebody is falling on hard times. But what it really comes down to is a culture of policing each other. And it's important to understand and acknowledge the history that started the home teaching and visiting teaching program. When the Mormons first moved out to what was then Mexico, that became the Utah Territory as a result of the Compromise of 1850, it was Brigham Young's land. It was his everything. It was his theocracy. It was his little fiefdom, right? So when he was appointed as the first territorial governor, well, in 1858, technically his governorship was set to come to an end, and he did not want to step down. So President at the time, James Buchanan, basically got in a standoff with the Mormons, and this is known as Buchanan's Blunder. He marched federal troops across the plains to forcibly remove Brigham Young, and a deal was brokered. That force never actually came. Brigham Young did step down, but what it did do is create a culture of anti-government and insulation and fear of the government in the Mormon community that was already long fostered by Joseph Smith, the first prophet. but was just really took root in Utah territory. And this is known as the Mormon Reformation era. And it's also referred to as the Mormon retrenchment era. And one thing that Brigham Young did was he imposed a rebaptism order and a recommitment, basically a faith test for every Mormon living in Utah. He wanted to make sure that they were loyal to him and not to whoever the president was bringing in to be the next governor of the territory. So he had everybody rebaptized. He had everybody consecrate all of their property to the church, which is essentially saying, hey, you church, you own everything. I'm just borrowing it for now. And part of that was instating home teaching and visiting teaching as a policing program to make sure that everybody is true and faithful and loyal to Brigham Young and not to the government itself. Right. So it's a holdover from this generation, and I should also note that it was instated by a guy named Jedediah Grant, who was known as Brigham's Sledgehammer. That's the guy who was tasked with overseeing the Utah Community Policing Force. And that practice lives long and well in the church today because it is one of the most effective tools at reinforcing compliance and orthodoxy within the community.
Sure. And that is the most effective way of engaging in a community control and thought policing, is you get people doing it to themselves or doing it to each other, that the leadership doesn't have to. Right. Any mechanism that does that's valid, right? Any way you can convince people that they have no boundaries or that they must be open and transparent at all times with their church, with their leaders, with their person, whoever that is. You create this kind of what I call a compliance culture or a conformity culture, and it's just taken as God's word, or the truth that the churches is that the church as a body is ultimately trustworthy, ultimately loyal to you, ultimately worth making all these sacrifices for, and therefore worth breaking down all of your boundaries. You don't get any of those when it comes to this because we're your salvation, right? Mm-hmm. Right?
Precisely. Yeah.
Exactly.
And so it's kind of leveraging that, to have the ultimate control over people during their lives.
And to go back to your question and answer it as succinctly as I possibly can, what is Mormonism? It is Big Brother, right? Yes. We have our Room 101. That's the councils of love, as they are called. We have our own Newspeak. We have the departments, like the Strengthening Church Members Committee, which is a secretive compartment within the church office building that specifically spies on the social presence of members of the church and builds files and dossiers on these people. And especially when somebody is a public antagonist of the church, they will publish these dossiers through surreptitious means. Even in the last big one, even violating HIPAA. And in order to smear these individuals, right? So like they have all of the hallmarks of totalitarianism, and it's just important to note that it came from Brigham Young creating a theocracy in a geographically isolated place, and the secular world slowly closing in on Utah, and Utah resisting the secular world. And that is the tension that Utah and the current corporate church finds itself in today. And the church has been extremely smart of comply with the laws on face value and get our own operatives within the laws so that they can change and tweak and champion religious liberties to make sure that we are never, ever accountable for any legal infractions. We can do any kind of dodgy investing, and we get a $5 million slap on the wrist by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And what that leads to is a hyper-insulated religious organization that is run by people who have business and law degrees instead of theology degrees, that has absolutely no oversight or accountability and has now become the wealthiest religion on the planet. Right. So what is Mormonism? It is Big Brother.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. I appreciate the directness, because it helps me to, navigate some of my own questions about this, because I've, over the years, you hear from various people, ex-members, current members, media, academics, people who study this stuff, and everybody's got opinions and takes on it, and yet I'm always looking for that lived experience, inside knowledge of what's the experience really like, and how does this organization really conduct itself, not theoretically, not as it should be or as I'd like it to be, because I'm a religious studies academic and I really like freedom of religion, so I really want to look at how the Mormons provide freedom of religion. You can make this look like anything you want it to, but I want to get to the real truth. So and I think lived experience and actual actions that are taken, and the culture of a thing is just as much the truth as whatever they're printing on their website. So I think there's anyway, I appreciate your insight on all of this, and it's pretty harsh. It's because I've been a little bit like, well, I think they're sort of, later stage culty. I mean, they've changed. Their dogma is liquid. They're able to keep up with customs, whereas some cults and groups die off because they just won't change. It becomes so anachronistic in their practices, and they just don't fit with the culture. And sometimes, like with the Amish, they're okay with that. They just kind of do their own thing, but they're not. It's not quite the same thing with the Amish as it is with Scientology, right? Where they're actually like really abusing these people. There's a lot of choices going on in the Amish community and a lot of informed consent, which you don't have over here, Speaking of, before I get into that, actually, I want to talk more structural things. I want to get a little bit more overview of this thing, just to give people the big picture here. How many people, right? And if I go to media and I go to the Church of Scientology and I say, how many Scientologists are there? They'll tell me 10 or 11 million, which is so not true. I mean, it's just so blatantly not true that it's all that you could pretty much get away with laughing in their face. It's so badly not true. There haven't even been that many people who bought a goddamn Dianetics book, right? I mean, there's just not that many people. And the shocking truth is, though, that when you actually run the numbers and you actually have the inside skinny, which I do, then you know that Scientology is a tiny, tiny little group of maybe 30,000 people internationally. So it's quite a big disparity between, their lies and the truth. But with the Mormons, I've always wondered. I've heard 7 million, something like that. But what's the truth? What's the census demographic of this group?
Yeah. Well, you have to take note that the Mormon Church, I think, put the word organized into organized religion. They organize the shit out of everything.
Okay.
And so numbers are kept. They're reported on every year at General Conference and all that kind of stuff. And so do you know what the actual numbers are last time, Bryce?
Yeah, the best, most rock solid numbers we can get are about 4 million. And the difficulty here also is the fluid definitions of activity level.
Right.
But I'm talking,
and that's 4 million active members or 4 million members?
Active.
Yeah. Okay.
People who are going, who regularly attend, people who attend more than 25 times per year. So, regular attendance. Most of these are weekly attending. People who are holding callings, actually acting agents within the church. That's 4 million is probably a pretty conservative estimate. The church will claim and has continued to claim record growth, fastest growing religion. I heard it all my life growing up. Yeah. They claim it today. They say 17 million people. By no metric is any of that phrasing or those numbers accurate.
Right.
And a big problem too that we have in the church is the actual retention rate. So the church is pushing missionary efforts efforts in non-industrialized countries very hard, because people in non-industrialized countries are much less likely to be able to access the internet, to be able to access alternative sources of information. So the church can put down a mission school basically, and have missionaries, a small headquarters there that they can send missionaries out into areas that are very remote, very inaccessible to anybody else. And they are having extremely good success numbers. Some of some African countries are having 7 to 8% growth, but the retention rate is unbelievably low, and that's primarily because the infrastructure isn't there to support regular attendance. When you're converting people who live in exceptionally rural or in inaccessible areas, the nearest ward house can be 120 miles away. They're not going to commute 120 miles every Sunday, both directions, in order to attend church. So they get baptized. They enjoy going to church for a little while. Maybe they read some of the Book of Mormon that's in their native language, but they are not active participating members. But their name still shows up in that 17 million number. So it's hard to define what technically constitutes active member, because there's so much variability in it. But people who are there every Sunday, about 4 million worldwide.
Right.
Okay. Are there places where Mormonism is not? You will not find Scientology in China, for example. You just won't. The Chinese government won't let them. Right? Do the Mormons, are they in China? Are they in Russia? Are they?
There are believing, practicing Mormons in China.
Right.
It is and most of them are transplants. It is a very, very tiny portion. But in all of the
Islamic countries?
I mean, there's some headway in some Islamic countries as well, but the more totalitarian government structures are pretty hesitant to be inviting to Mormonism, because it's such a America first religion. It's a very, very America religion. It's a white supremacist religion as well, which the doctrine itself is white supremacist, so that hampers some missionary efforts. But all but Antarctica, every continent, there are Mormons. And there are probably even Mormon research scientists living in Antarctica. Who knows? So Mormonism has a presence everywhere. But where you could go and recognize a Mormon church, that's pretty small pockets of global geography.
Even to the extent where it's like with Islamic countries, in several of those, the Mormon presence there are the American soldiers who are Mormon.
Oh,
and
sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. Okay.
So like my spouse was in Afghanistan at the time they established a Middle Eastern branch, because they had enough Mormon soldiers out in Iraq and Iran, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and I forget the other one. So they're able to establish a branch, which is like a little smaller than a ward. And that covered all of them. They couldn't proselytize at all. They couldn't tell anyone they were Mormon, who wasn't an American, because that was a death sentence for the person they were talking to as well as themselves. But they had a branch there, so the church had a presence there.
Wow. But the majority, you would say, the vast majority of active Mormon practitioners would be in the continental United States
And South America.
Yep.
And South America. Any particular place in South America where they're more concentrated?
Brazil is huge.
Really?
Huge.
Yeah.
But then again, it's also the biggest country down there. The South Americans in general, of all of the missionaries, the highest rate of baptism has been South America for the most part. Of English speaking, it's Utah, but of all things. But in South America, they would aim it as, the Book of Mormon is about your ancestors. This is great. We're bringing it back to you. Remember Quetzalcoatl? Well, that was Jesus. And see, it's here in this book, and all that shit. So that's why. But there's also the problem that you run into, and this has happened numerous times over the centuries of them, the 2 centuries the church has been in place, is missionaries using another method to convince people to join. So, like, I mean, when I was out, it was a big deal going on in one of the South American countries. They had to send a general authority down to fix it because the missionaries were playing basketball with kids on the street regularly. They would let them play one or two games with them, and then they'd say, "Oh, you got to join our church if you want to keep playing." And this goes back to the, retention thing because they would get baptized so they could play basketball, but they never went to church.
No, no. You would not call that an honest conversion on any metric.
Not at all, in any way, shape, or form.
No, that's just desperate missionaries trying to get their numbers.
Exactly.
Get the numbers up. And that's exactly it, right? The mission presidents are putting a lot of pressure on the missionaries to have good numbers of how many books of Mormon they gave out, how many conversations, how many appointments did they have, how many baptisms did they get that week. I mean, these are weekly reports, daily reports, monthly reports that you're sending to your mission president. And
they are weekly reports. You have to send those in. And
there you go.
Most of the numbers are the same for each mission, but there will be extras that your mission president specifically asked for. Like one man I know on his mission, he was required to report how many times he prayed each day.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
You're not just reporting like how many tracting hours, which is the going out knocking on doors. You have to report that for the week. You have to report how many Book of Mormons, how many of the discussions you teach. There's 6 discussions you teach, how many new contacts you have, how many old contacts you have, how many of your investigators, as they call the people that they're teaching, how many investigators went to church that Sunday, how many commitments you have for the next discussion, how many baptismal commitments you have, how many baptisms have you had that week. Yeah, these numbers matter.
Yeah, no, I get it. You're talking to a former Scientologist, and who we were all about numbers, and I am so fascinated by this because there are few groups that are that obsessive, I guess we'll say, when it comes to what we used to call substats. Okay, so in Scientology you have statistics, and that number is, or that word is really not a modern usage of the word. It's a word that is about lines on a graph. You're keeping graphs of everything, and every single thing that you're tracking, you can plot on a graph over time, right? Last week I got 10, this week I got 20, right? The line goes up. Do the Mormon missionaries graph this stuff, or do they just keep the numbers like in a spreadsheet?
You keep them on a spreadsheet. It's graphed at the mission office.
It is. There's graphs. Do you know when this began? Has it always been this way, or did this start at some point? Because
it probably started at some point, because I mean, the earliest missionaries, you're talking about Joseph Smith himself calling them to go out. And I don't think they reported much of anything then. I'm not sure.
To the contrary, they did. I mean, they reported contributions that they were able to get from faithful members. So there was some forms of checks and balances with the missionaries of Joseph Smith era missionaries. But yeah, it's absolutely nothing like what missionaries are doing today. The streamlining effect of it, I would probably have to point that to N. Eldon Tanner.
Yes.
He's this guy who was the last generation of leadership. I want to say he died in the early aughts, early 2000s, maybe it was 90s. Anyway, he was essentially a business whiz, and he took the church from running in the negative, almost being bankrupt, to today posturing it to be the wealthiest religion on the planet. It was really he was historian of the church D. Michael Quinn said that N. Eldon Tanner was the last man alive who knew all of the financials of the church. When he died, the business empire of the church is so vast that with the amount of institutional knowledge that was lost when N. Eldon Tanner died, means that basically nobody alive today has a full overview of how big the church's business empire is. And N. Eldon Tanner was responsible for streamlining a lot of things, and I wouldn't be surprised if being really hard on the missionaries, getting these stats, running these programs so that they're getting the hard numbers, they're seeing exactly where they need to put more resources exactly where they need to start building church buildings, where they need to put temples. He was the kind of person who saw all of these, galaxy of floating data points and put them together into cohesive and actionable programs.
He died in 1982. He was born in 1898 and died in 1982. He was actually born in Canada. And that's another interesting thing because he's not American or Utah born at all. But
because he was a polygamy refugee, just like my grandma was, right? My grandma was born in Canada as well because of the federal government cracking down on polygamy. A lot of Mormon polygamists fled to Canada and Mexico. That's where my line hails from.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because we know about, the FLDS and the various polygamy camps and groups that are scattered throughout the desert regions of Utah and Idaho and Arizona. At least that's what I hear. That's what I've seen. But I wasn't aware of Canada and Mexico. Jesus.
Yeah.
Chihuahua, Mexico was one of the biggest ones.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And these communities, 1 degree or another, still around today.
Yeah, absolutely.
There
are more.
Yeah.
And as is the case with any kind of factional break off of some kind of a mothership, organization, there's, factions within factions. There are way more today than there were when my grandma was growing up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Getting back to the finances, though, you said something I'm confused by because it's an interesting piece of information. You go, okay, this guy was the last guy to have a full picture of all the business stuff. But then I go, well, wait a minute. What the hell are these counselors, these prophets sitting around talking about then? I mean, how do they not have a full picture of this? Aren't they running the businesses?
I mean, this is how big business works, right? You have board members, and each member of the board is tasked with chairing certain committees, right? So each apostle runs anywhere from 2 to 30 committees, and they gather the meetings and all the information from those various committees, and then they present it to their fellow brethren in the meetings with just the apostles, and then they decide what to do and how to delegate resources and where to focus and where to ignore and what their next steps are. And they also, hire like research agencies in order to find out like what's effective advertising, where's, demographics that we could, our message might resonate with. How do we tailor that message to hit social media and, conceal that it's Mormon, but make it look just standard fair Christianity until someone clicks on it and, requests a Bible. Oh, and they're requesting a Book of Mormon at the same time. So the church puts a lot of resources into how do we effectively get our message out there, and people convert without thinking Mormon. They just think, oh, this is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So anyway, the overall takeaway from that is that there are so many sub-organizations under the umbrella of the corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that it's just too vast for any single person to know how big it is. And we're talking multiple investment arms. We're talking multiple for-profit businesses. We're talking multiple media agencies. We're talking insurance companies. We're talking housing and development. We're talking real estate development. We're talking the biggest mall in Utah. I mean, the business empire is just so goddamn vast that we're talking an empire that's worth over $200 billion, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's
we're
insane.
talking about a lot of money. And so really you're looking at a business empire that kind of has a side line of some religion.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
In a way. I mean, Jesus. And
which is their smallest money-making part. Yeah.
Well, when you look at the fact that there are, for profit, that these tax-free accounts that they have literally hundreds of billions in, that they own strip malls, that they own, the real estate development stuff. This is the kind of thing that they know that puts Scientology's real estate portfolio. It's like a little tiny thing, compared to this empire. And I'm once you start, kind of getting a picture of this, which is why I wanted to kind of start with the bigger picture of this, your jaw hits the ground. You just can't believe these people are getting away with this in broad daylight, in plain sight, in plain sight.
Yep.
Welcome to our hell, Chris.
Yep.
Welcome to our hell.
And
we saved you a seat.
I still live here in Utah, which is a theocracy still.
Yeah, I know.
The Mormon Church runs Utah. Yes.
I know. There is no separation. I know.
None at all.
It's really bad. on the finance stuff, okay, so how much do you really know? How transparent? Do they publish meeting minutes or anything? Like, how do you know?
Oh God, they're so secretive.
Sweet summer child.
Right. Well,
Mhm.
I guess I'm not expecting transparency, but I'm just wondering, how do you know what happens at these meetings and these, and all this stuff? You say they're very organized. I believe you. Um, but how public is this stuff, or how deep do you have to go to get to that there are 30 subcommittees and all this information and strip malls and stuff? How far down do you have to go?
So it's a matter of collating a lot of information from a lot of different sources, and the vast majority of that information comes from sources who were not authorized to share that information.
Okay.
So there's a number of whistleblower complaints that have come out, a fair amount of information that has leaked through one way or another. We had for quite a long time very active in the ex-Mormon space. It was called Mormon Leaks, and it was set up as a secure server to allow people to anonymously upload information, documents, pictures, whatever needed to be uploaded, and then it would be distributed anonymously online. And that was an age of transparency for the church that it hated, that all of us in the ex-Mormon sphere loved, because it was airing out a lot of dirty laundry. So a fair amount of information comes from that, as well as the big whistleblower complaint that came out in late 2019 that revealed a lot about the church's finances. But they're, as far as the best source for all of it to try and gain just a view of the tip of the iceberg is D. Michael Quinn's third book in his Mormon Hierarchy series. It's called Wealth and Corporate Power. So D. Michael Quinn did this 3-book series, Mormon Hierarchy. It's kind of I don't know, the tomes of his legacy. They're truly unbelievably, remarkably well researched books. And his third installment was Wealth and Corporate Power. It's 3 chapters and 21 appendices worth of information. And it's all just about the corporate empire of the church, from Joseph Smith and what he established, the way that he ran the business, all the way up into modernity. And of course, there's significant blind spots in it. I believe the book was published before the whistleblower. It was the year or 2 years before the whistleblower complaint came out. But basically, when the complaint came out, it merely confirmed a lot of the information that was available in Wealth and Corporate Power.
Okay.
So it is to say that the church does not want the information out there. They try and work very, very hard to conceal how vast their empire is. But when you have an empire that's staffed with, a few thousand people, that spans global, right? It is a global organization that is controlling this much wealth. It is impossible to keep it a secret. It is impossible to keep these things from getting out in the public.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay. So now the last thing I want to ask you about today, and then we'll sort of move toward wrapping up. But boy, we've got so much. Okay. So you have these wards, which are basically congregations, and you assign some schlep to run that ward. And here's your handbook. Go.
Yes.
Now,
Mhm.
okay. And then you say, okay, well, there's no accountability. There's nobody running that bishop.
Well, there kind of is.
There must be, because
Because the organization of it is such that you have the wards, that are made up of families. So families first, and the father is the patriarch of the family. So he's in charge of it. And then the larger bit is the bishop is the patriarch of the ward. But then you have a collection of wards that are called a stake, stake. And then you have a president in charge of that, and you have the high council, which is council of 12 members, and they go out and speak at the other wards. But then you also have a collection of stakes that is a region, and you have a regional rep for that who comes out of the 70, the quorum of the 70, which is underneath the quorum of the 12 apostles. So that's general authorities in the quorum of the 70. For a while, there was like 5 quorums of the 70 or something. I don't remember how many. 2 through 5 or 2 through however many there were temporary. They'd be called in for like 5 years or something. But the first quorum of the 70 was for life. But now I think there's just one, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And so
essentially.
essentially there's just one, and then you just get retired when you're like 70 something. But so yeah, that's how the all of the stuff happens. So then a statement will come down from the first presidency where it's signed by those three, and it gets sent down to regents, stakes, bishops, and then it's read in the ward, however it's done. Those kind of things. And so that's how the oversight happens.
Okay.
So if you want to complain about your bishop, you have to complain to your stake president. If you try to go directly to the prophet, it is automatically bounced back to your stake president, who then is going to say, oh, well, he was called of God. Are you sure it wasn't your problem? I don't know. Well, you
Yeah.
ever heard of
Well,
this? Maybe
and
it was an aberration.
yeah, and that's a super important point. The stake president is the one responsible for calling the bishop. So you are going to talk to the stake president to complain about the bishop that he called, that he believes he used his own power of discernment in order to call this bishop, and knew that God spoke to him, telling him that this man would be a good fit for bishop. And now you're here complaining? You're
Right.
questioning
And
God?
especially because, it says in the scriptures that God will not allow his leaders to lead the prophet to lead the church astray, or he will remove him from his place. So therefore, if the prophet is the one who approved who got called as bishop, because it does go up to see the prophet and they just make the final decision, then you are the one with the problem if you're saying he made a mistake, because God would just remove him from his place, because that would be a problem on the prophet, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
therefore, what are you doing wrong?
Right. Well, this is pretty typical. I mean, that's pretty typical behavior 101, behavior control. So that makes sense to me, but I was just curious about the structure of it, because there must be a system for, if you name a bishop, and I don't care how discerning you are, how much God blessed you, if this guy starts, doing stuff that is obviously and blatantly a threat to the church, like, sexual violations and stuff like that, I know they're not going to make it public, but
Well,
I mean,
the ones that end up public are the ones where, like, the police were brought in before
yeah,
anything, or if it's not the sexual side. The sexual side doesn't. I mean, they just look the other way on that, just like Catholics did. But yes, they do. And in fact, with all the Protect LDS Children and everything, the most they did after that was to establish the bishop's hotline. If a problem comes in, which the hotline didn't go to, like, counselor support, therapy support, or even the police. The hotline went straight to the lawyers for the church so they could tell the bishop what to do. So,
right.
anyway, but what would make it public is if the bishop did something illegal outside of his bishop's office.
Okay.
That's where it goes to the public. He
Right.
goes and robs a bank and is caught. Yeah, that's going to be seen.
Right.
And that's going to end up. But they will cover up every other fucking thing, especially the sexual sins.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's no surprise. I'm not at all surprised, of course.
I know.
And as tragic and disgusting as it is,
I
that's
mean, this church was started by a sexual predator, for fuck's sake.
I get it. Of course.
As was the next prophet and the next. I'm like, dude, Brigham Young was worse than Joseph Smith. Okay.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, where I was going with all that, I'm just trying to understand the structure of this. And no, I get it. I totally get it. You're right to be outraged. It's not wrong.
Especially as a woman. Yeah.
I mean, come on. There is, see, I'm sort of semi-deftly, trying to navigate a little bit, because there is nothing that upsets me faster than children being abused in these groups. So we're going to have that conversation, but we're not going to have that conversation today. I want to just get structurally what's going on here and what the accountability system is, because I'm curious, when do you think the level is reached where they start getting what's really going on? Like, they see, oh, this is what this is really all about. Is there a level like that, or are these people... See, in Scientology, I'm going to keep making that comparison just because it's one I can describe and understand it, because my audience does. you got to get all the way to the guy at the very top before it becomes super clear that Scientology ain't doing what Scientology says it's doing. There's an apparency the entire time that every task is mission appropriate and on source, as they say, follows L. Ron Hubbard's directions and intentions, right? And David Miscavige, the head of the church, is simply continuing to forward L. Ron Hubbard's intentions and objectives and doing what he says. And he's not, but he spins it so the belief, you know, the followers, the membership believes that that's what he's doing and keeps paying into it. So feeding propaganda to the flock is just kind of 101 for the guys at the top. But I'm kind of wondering, who are the guys at the top who understand what's really going on? Is it this quorum of 12, or are these 70 guys in on it too? Or, you know what I mean? Or is it all just these guys are just glaze-eyed and if the prophet says it, I do it. If the prophet says it, I do it. And the thinking stops there. I'm just kind of trying to understand the headspace of these guys at the top.
I suspect that the majority of them do know. They know they are the man behind this curtain. There might be some that truly do believe all this shit, but particularly when you are there in the nuts and bolts part of working that whole thing, I think the majority of them know. I mean, this is something we don't have any hard thing on because, how can you? Because it's getting them to admit to the truth, which they don't do. I mean, they will deliberately lie from one time to the next because they're changing the narrative whenever they feel like it. And so that's one of the issues you run into. But I suspect there's a lot of them that do know.
Okay.
And so, because there's just too many times, just too many times when somebody's done something wrong and it's too obvious for them not to. Yeah.
Right. What's the oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, I kind of I try and I think I come to kind of a different conclusion. And that is that you get to a certain point of leadership in the church, and that question of do you truly believe it is completely irrelevant. And what I mean by that is getting into the upper rungs of church leadership is such a viciously and ugly competitive space for the men there.
That was my next question.
So damn competitive.
Yeah. How do you get there?
And there's so much nepotism in it as well.
Yeah. It's who you know.
I introed myself by saying I have pioneer Mormon blood. You almost have to have some kind of pioneer blood in order to get into the highest ranking positions. If you have leadership pioneer blood, then all the better, all the more power to you. Yeah. Literally, all the more power to you. But I think that because the system requires such a bifurcated mind for the participants, that I have church side and I have reality side, and never the twain shall meet. That we have, a church office building, the tallest building in Utah, staffed full of true dyed-in-the-wool believing Mormons that will never think critically about their decisions, about what they are doing, about if what they are doing is actually, true, because what they are doing is they are working towards building the kingdom of God. Of course, that's a good thing, no matter what. And when my overall goal is to build New Jerusalem, to build the kingdom of God, prepare this world for the second coming of Jesus, sure, we have some weird business meetings. Yeah, sure, we have to hire some ad agencies to help us get our message across. Sure, we have to do things that make this church look more like a business. But at the end of the day, we are saving the world. The Constitution will hang by a thread, and we are the ones responsible for saving the Constitution.
Yeah.
So
the ends
there's
justify
one part
the
of
means.
that.
Yeah.
And there is the compartmentalization, and I think that the further you get up into the super duper cloistered highest concentric ring of leadership, that the vast majority of those men have just lived in a space of cognitive dissonance of I do not not let any secular questions touch the church side of my brain, that the question of is what I'm doing true or not is a completely irrelevant and a never considered question.
Yeah.
But then it's also a case-by-case basis that you can look at individual people who are in the leadership, and you know for a fact that they know. You look at Dallin Oaks, the way that he talks, the way he speaks from the pulpit, the types of things that he does, and the policies that he is responsible for, like the November policy. He strikes me as somebody who is true to his faith, that God hates the gays and everything that is the ultra conservative agenda. And at the same time, he is the most duplicitous speaking man I have ever seen. He is trying to hammer Jello to a wall. It is impossible to get him to commit to any single thing through the way that he talks, which leads me to conclude he knows this is all a farce. He knows that he has to give some kind of a legal cover to everything the church is doing, but he knows in his heart that his God believes all of the bigotry that he himself believes, so he will do whatever necessary. We have a phrase in Mormonism called lying for the Lord. One of the most sacred things you can do is lying for the Lord. And Oaks is one who strikes me as, yeah, no, that's his calling card, is lying for the Lord. Quentin L. Cook is another one. He's the history communicator for the church, and anytime that Quentin L. Cook is making a speech, I rage because I see the propaganda, I see the apologetics, I see the lies and the obfuscations that he does, because he knows the history, he knows the correlated narrative, he knows the non-correlated narrative, and by virtue of his position chairing the history committees, that he knows that he is lying, and that is he's a reprehensible human being.
Because what's your nickname for him?
The smarmy little pencil pusher.
Yep.
Wow.
He's a right proper son of a bitch.
And he's the one who's next in line to be the next prophet.
Luckily not.
No, Quentin L. Cook is an inferior apostle in every sense of the definition.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the pencil pusher guy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, but Dallin Oaks is the guy who came up with the November policy.
Correct.
Yep. He was a lawyer. He had actually been on the Utah Supreme Court, no less, and had been a president of BYU. And it's interesting that the presidents of BYU that are in the Quorum of the 12 are some of the scariest. Bednar was over BYU, Idaho, and was just a vicious president there. And Jeffrey Holland was one when I was at BYU, and he was the one that did the musket fire speech towards LGBTQ plus students.
Yeah. And background on that. Yeah, he called for more. So he was speaking in a conversation, a church forum.
It was at BYU.
At BYU, at a church forum, essentially, about the current political issues. And he gave this talk in 2020, I believe it was, right? In summer of 20 or fall of 2020.
Right. And just for background, too, the previous graduation, the valedictorian spoke, and he came out of the closet when he spoke. Right. Yes, and so this is really basically the church's reaction to it.
Yeah. So Holland got up and he said that he said essentially that I'm paraphrasing to the best of my ability, that we need to hear more musket fire from the institution in the South, meaning the BYU. He's talking about BYU Provo. He was mad that the academics weren't stepping up and defending the church in public forums.
Yes.
So we call it the musket fire speech because he said that he wants more musket fire.
And
that is more vitriolic bigotry coming out of the academic institution of BYU.
Got it.
He wants the BYU to defend the church's bigotry.
And the policies are getting worse. Right now, there's the witch hunt at BYU with the professors who are siding with LGBTQ plus and who are not. And the ones who side with them are getting fired.
Right.
Yeah, BYU has pretty regular purges of the progressive academics, pretty regularly. It's on anywhere from a 15 to 40-year cycle when too much academia gets into BYU, they will get rid of the true academics.
The philosophy and English departments get hit the hardest every time.
That makes sense.
The ones that teach you how to think.
Well, if you're going to run an information control operation, then you got to control the information.
Yes, you do.
I mean, bottom line, right? I mean, are we surprised? No.
Nope.
This is interesting because this conversation, actually more so than any other conversation I've had, has put some things in place for me that make the Mormon Church, one, smaller than I thought that it was, which is very good news to me.
Yes.
But two, also sort of raises it in threat level more to the Christian nationalists, Seven Mountain, sort of Liberty University kind of thing. These really hardcore, abortion is murder 100% of the time. I don't care if he raped you. You're going to have the kid anyway, because that's the only thing you're good for, lady, right? And that's kind of the attitude of the evangelical Christian nationalists, is very old school Stone Age kind of thinking. Very reminiscent of a lot of things you have said today, right? So I see that these things are more alike than I had earlier thought. And I'm disturbed by that.
Everyone should be.
Because you see someone, and here's where it becomes so difficult to get your wits around, is from the outside perspective. You see someone. Okay, don't kill me. I'm this outside spectator guy, right? So I see somebody like Mitt Romney,
Mm-hmm.
who to me represents a Mormon who at least had the integrity to not fall in line to Trump's blatant authoritarianism, right?
Right.
Even though it probably could have done him and his career and maybe his church some good to do so. But he didn't. And I look at that and I go, I have to respect that this is a man who at least lives principles, and that those are principles I could at least agree with at that level. At least he's not coddling up to a totalitarian dictator. Okay, good.
Because he already sold his soul to a different one. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
But I look at Mitt and I look at how he talks and I look at the things that he says, and I'm no Mitt expert. Like I said, I have passing familiarity with this man, only to the degree that he was going for president. And I was like, who is this guy, right? And how should I be concerned because he's a Mormon? And I ended up, learning about the temple ceremonies enough that I was like, yeah, this guy can't be president because the church will always be the senior thing to him.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be a bigot. I don't want to assume, that with Mitt that he's going to take that phone call and going to do what the church tells him, if he was sitting in the White House. But it's a risk, and it's one that, as a cult guy, I got to go, yeah, that's a thing.
When somebody stands in temple clothing and mimics slicing their throat,
exactly,
if they reveal the secrets of what they are taking that oath seriously. And when part of that oath is, I promise to consecrate all of my property, my increase, everything to the church, they are making that oath to God. I am happy to give them the benefit of the doubt and just fucking believe them when they say those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And take note too, that covenant, the death oath you took on that one was being disemboweled. Of all of the three of those cuts that happen, that's the one you take the longest to die from.
Well said.
And that's also the one covenant that, as far as I'm aware, has never, if any wording on it that was ever changed was making it even more extreme. But it's like there have been a lot of changes in the temple in the last 40 years. I mean, I went through in 1988 the first time. So there have been a lot of changes that's happened since then. The wording of that covenant has not.
Right.
All the others have.
Yeah, it's I guess where I was going with all that is that it just didn't look that bad.
Right.
Their PR is pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I just want to soapbox one final time before we sign off, because you bring up a couple of related threads that are very important here.
Yeah.
The Mormon Church did not jump into bed with Trump. They made a very delicate calculation and realized that Trumpism is too publicly radical for them, even though they want everything in Project 2025. They want everything that the Trump presidency is doing. So when the church is able to bill itself as a middle of the road, yes, it's a conservative institution, but it's a rational conservative institution. It's not a Trump conservative institution. That stands to be something that can be much more appealing in the future once Trumpism vacillates back to becoming unpopular again. Whatever circumstances take place that cause Trumpism to reduce in popularity, the church wants to be able to look back at their history and say, look, we never were Trumpers. We've just been, we've just been academic, upright, conservative institution this whole time. So Mitt
Plausible
Romney...
deniability.
Precisely. So Mitt Romney positioning himself as an anti-Trumper is perfectly in line with what the church wants. So that is also to say that Mitt Romney is hopelessly and disgustingly church broke. That man has a gelatin spine. There is absolutely nothing to Mitt Romney beyond the church. So the church itself brands certain politicians with a badge of valor that they call church broke. We say that this politician is church broke as an indictment of their ethics. They say this politician is church broke, and that therefore we can give them a call, right? So we need to understand that the number of church broke politicians vastly outweighs the church's actual presence in population statistics. We're talking nationwide. Mormons represent maybe 3-4% of the American population. There's almost 20% of our elected representatives are Mormon. So they're way
federal level.
At the federal level. So Mormons are 20%. way overrepresented in politics. Unbelievably overrepresentative. And you consider that also the most powerful political force in America is the evangelical Christianity. But the one thing about evangelical Christianity is it is definitionally a disparate community. There is no hierarchical structure to it. It is just, we are all evangelical Christians. We all want these things that subjugate women and kill the gays. We all want these things, right? We can all agree. We're all brothers here. Well, Mormonism is stratified, top-down leadership. And it controls way too much money. So we have the position, the church is positioned as the wealthiest church in America, in the world, right? It is, if we were talking about just net worth of the church compared to the wealthiest individuals, we're talking like the church should be ranked like 5th or 6th wealthiest person on the planet, right? It's fucking insane how much money this church has. They are way overrepresented in politics, and they want everything in Project 2025, but they want to give it a shiny, non-Trumpian, smiling Mormon missionary face to all of this religious bigotry and more importantly to Christian exceptionalism. And I mean, we can talk about this in another episode, but the Book of Mormon is a white supremacist text. Mormonism is a white supremacist religion. So they are white supremacists masquerading as just your friendly neighborhood dentist or car salesman. That's your local Mormon. And that's the thing, is there's enough integration of Mormonism in America that pretty much everybody has a neighbor, has a coworker, has a family member who is Mormon. And that is, no matter where you live, no matter where you are, most people know a Mormon. And of course, if you're in Utah, it's right. But if you're in Utah, I mean, everybody there just is. It is an assumption. You see somebody walking down the street, the assumption is they are Mormon until proven otherwise. So I just want it us all to recognize that this is an organization of somewhere between 3 and 4 million people who look towards Russell M. Nelson or whoever the prophet is as the mouthpiece of God. They hold complete control over the church. And the church has what it often touts as one of the better prepper movements within it, right? The church tells members to make sure you have at least 72 hours worth of provisions in your basements, preferably, years worth of food supply. Lots of Mormons really love their guns as well. So we're talking about a geographically isolated in what we call Morador, the Mormon corridor, right? Utah, Idaho, Arizona. This Mormon corridor is geographically isolated. They are beholden, the majority of the people living there are beholden to one individual who is sitting on a wealth fund as large as the wealthiest businessmen in the world. And they have way, way too much control in politics. So what we're talking about here, yes, is a quirky, fun cult that has a goofy history, but it also represents one of the greatest security risks to the American nation and to the world, to world stability. This is a dangerous, dangerous movement, and all it takes is somebody ascending to the rank of prophet who has, and society to slightly change from how it is for the levers and mechanisms to fall into place where Mormonism is truly a force of nature to reckon with.
Right. Okay, fair enough. I get it. And I appreciate everything you guys have said today. Okay, we have a bigger problem here than I thought we did. And I knew
we
it was
will be doing this for the next year. Okay.
Yeah, we are. There are things that you talked about here that I absolutely want to pursue in more detail. The structure a little bit, the and also, there's a lot of things we've barely touched on, because there's the cult member as victim, and then there's the cult member as victimizer. And both of these things can be true and often are true at the same time.
Right.
And that's a nuanced conversation, right? There's levels to that, and I'd like to get into some of that stuff because I want to understand it, because it's not a matter of painting with a black and white brush with this, right? There's a bunch of people who have been raised in this. They never questioned it because it was always their normal. Then there's people who embrace this because they are just openly bigoted, racist scumbags. And then there's the people at the top who know what the hell they're doing, and whether they're on a religious crusade or they're in it for themselves, what they're doing is not okay on any moral metric you want to measure. And that's my fight with this, right? That's my problem with this is, hey, these guys are saying they're doing one thing. They're massive hypocrites. And that needs to be known about and understood. And the fact that they control a state of this nation is, as you said, Bryce, it's troubling. It's a problem. It's not just something to let sit there and, it's not a big deal because the Mormons are a bunch of nice people. I hope just today we might have shown you some reasons why that's not really just a cool thing to say. It's not right. They're not just a bunch of cool people, and they're not just minding their own business, and it's not just another religion. And we've already got plenty of the elements of that just in this one show, much less if you go down my channel and start looking at the details of some of the other nonsense that's gotten up to with this group. So I look forward to more conversations with you guys.
Good. So do we.
Likewise. This was a lot of fun. And hopefully the voice of warning, is not too much of a downward departure here at the end of the show. But I just this is a soapbox that I jump on every opportunity I possibly can get, because it's so damn important to get the message out there. This is a dangerous cult. There are cults that are, by definition, cults are dangerous. This, in my opinion, is the most dangerous cult.
And I can see why you would say that. And at the level of social impact and threat, I can see a lot of problems here. I can see a lot. So I think we've got a number of things to highlight and talk about in exposing, some of the abuses and some of the nonsense of this group in our future. So how do people find you guys? The GlassBox podcast we talked about, where is that? How do they connect with you guys?
Go ahead, Bryce.
Sure. So anywhere that you download podcasts, the GlassBox podcast, we release every 2 weeks. We do long episodes because we like to be very thorough and see what's slipped through the cracks. We also do long form book reviews of really terrible and damaging Mormon books and just analyze at a granular level. So that's where to find that show. And then if you want to go through the serialized history of Mormonism from the inception to, the death of Joseph Smith, that's Naked Mormonism. That's my solo hosted podcast.
Excellent. And that you're looking at 10 years?
Yeah.
That's how long you did that. Yeah.
So started in 2014.
Hell of a lot.
There's a lot there.
It's a big backlog. Yeah.
I get it. These are deep subjects when you get into all the minutia and details of it. Let me ask you one question real fast as we wrap up, just because it's a little timely. What was that show? American Primeval?
Mhm.
Thumbs up, thumbs down. What's your take on?
I haven't
I've
watched
heard
it yet.
I've heard that it's accurate in tone, if not in detail.
I haven't watched it yet, but
Okay.
I presume from what all of my social spaces have been saying about it that it's a good show and accurate enough.
Ah,
Fair enough.
okay, I'm looking it up.
Okay, because I was curious. I was thinking about watching it, but I don't want to watch it if it's going to give me a bunch of false information about what actually went down. But at the same time, if I'm watching it for tone and culture, and this is kind of the spirit of the thing, then I don't have to get into all the minutiae and details of it and nitpick it apart. I'm just going to kind of walk away with it from that point of view. But I wanted to see what you guys had to say, so you'll have to go watch it and then tell me.
I'll just say the era it's depicting, I referenced it, talked a little bit about it, is the Mormon Reformation period. We're talking
Right.
1857. So if you're wanting one of the best books on that, look up Will Bagley's book called Blood of the Prophets. It talks about this era of the church history, what the culture was like, just how insular and frightful everything was, how Brigham Young deliberately crafted all of the social pressures that resulted in the Mountain Meadows Massacre and foster this insular and very big brother like community. So that's an excellent resource if you're wanting the hard history to understand the context of what American Primeval is depicting on film. That's a great resource to start.
Awesome. Good. All right, guys. Well, thanks very much for being part of this today, and we'll get together again soon.
Yes.
This was
See
a
you
pleasure.
next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All right, folks out there. If you found this podcast at all interesting, informative, and entertaining, consider subscribing. Consider joining on Patreon, signing up, helping me out, keeping the show going. All of this happens because of you guys. All right. And with that, I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.